So I promise we didn't plan this whole program and create this whole theme just so Jane, Ted, and Nils could argue on stage, but it is a nice bonus. I think it was a couple months ago that our moderator, Matt, wrote, quote, "You can't just come up with a nice-sounding, high-level message. You need the capacity to design ideas that make sense and work in detail," which was really sort of what we had in mind when we designed all of these sessions at this conference, including this morning's session on sort of real on-the-ground implementation, and this conversation on sort of how much the ideas sort of in vogue right now in policymaking and in our broader politics make sense beyond just the phrase industrial policy. What does that mean? You're all going to tell us now. So please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage.
All right, thank you. Industrial policy, it's so hot right now. And I think, arguably nobody knows what it means at all. Our title here, it was supposed to be Slouching Toward Industrial Policy, so I tried to look up the reference, and I saw that there's a debate. It's a Yeats poem about slouching toward Bethlehem. And people seem to disagree as to whether you're supposed to interpret that line as sort of like collapsing, right? Like you're slouching toward industrial policy, or does it mean that you're moving relentlessly, like slowly but with purpose and determination? So that seems, I think, like a good framing for this, actually, is like, what is this industrial policy concept that the world has hit on? Is it just a kind of a second best? We couldn't achieve decarbonization through some other means, so we've decided to invoke industrial policy? Or is there a real vision and determination and theory of industrial policy that can ground us and can drive, transformation of the energy system, possibly agriculture, possibly industry, and so much more. Nils loves big ideas. I hate big ideas, but I've been charged with this panel anyway. And so maybe you can tell us something about, what is this moment of industrial policy beyond specific pieces of legislation?
Sure, thanks, Matt. So maybe I can start with a different reference, which is I often think when people say, people ask me, what do you think of America's new industrial policy? And I often paraphrase what Gandhi said when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, I think it would be a good idea. And I think, I feel the same way about industrial policy. I think it would be a good idea. I don't think we're quite there yet, but what I'd like to do is do a little bit of kind of historical table setting of where I think we are right now in the arc of American history, and how industrial policy, I think, fits into that. So a lot of people have talked about neoliberalism. I don't really love that term, but we were in an era from approximately late 70s and early 80s until sometime in the teens that was dominated by a set of ideas that have come to be called neoliberal, that were governed by Hayekian notions of information economics. Public choice theory said that you couldn't, if you had too much centralization of power, there was inevitably regulatory capture of various sorts, and there was skepticism about whether government could fundamentally do things. And this is characterized famously by Ronald Reagan's line that 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." And that attitude towards government, the relationship between government and economy, I think dominated during this era. Here I would cite the work of Gary Gerstle, who's a historian at Cambridge, and he talks about different eras, what Marxists would call regimes, what he calls an order, and that there was a New Deal order that lasted from the 30s to the late 70s, and then there was a neoliberal order that lasted from the late 1970s and early 1980s through until pretty recently. And what's characteristic of an order in Gerstle's characterization is that there's a dominant set of ideas. There's a major party that dominates those ideas. The minor party initially resists those ideas because they were the champion of the previous order, but then over time they come to accept it. And so, classically, Eisenhower said, basically accepted the New Deal. And that was a moment when the New Deal order was really consolidated, is when even the Republicans kind of accepted the principles of the New Deal in terms of the relationship between state and economy. Likewise, Democrats resisted the rise of what Gerstle calls the new neoliberal order throughout the 1980s. They lost a bunch of elections, and eventually the DLC and Clinton come in and actually consolidate the revolution of what we now call neoliberalism. I think we're at a similar moment of historical transition right now as what we saw in the late 1970s. And I'm about to make a couple of comparisons that are, whenever you make historical comparisons, you don't want to take it too far, but I think it might be illuminating in one respect. And I make these comparisons because I think that even though the characters of the people involved could not be more different, their historical functions are quite similar. When Jimmy Carter came into office in the late 1970s, the country was suffering from stagflation and a series of other ills that were commonly ascribed to the fact that the New Deal mechanisms of Keynesian demand management were no longer working to maintain full employment or to keep inflation down. And there was a general crisis of the political economy. And actually, these changes that we now refer to as neoliberal began, they're often credited to Reagan, but they actually began under Carter, deregulation. Many people in this room know this story very well. The deregulation, independent central banks, the importance of hard money in keeping a low inflationary environment. Those core principles of the neoliberal era really begin under Carter and then really accelerate under Reagan. But it's important to understand that the Reagan administration didn't come in with it's remembered now as a great triumph, particularly on the right, but it wasn't really that clear that Reagan was going to be a successful president when he first came in. He only barely squeaked into office. If Carter had managed to rescue those hostages in Tehran, maybe Reagan would have lost. It was sort of a fluke election in that way. And actually, through the beginning of the fall of 1983, 2.5 years into his term, he was underwater in terms of approval ratings. Reaganomics didn't seem like it was actually going to be effective. And then we know what happened. In the next year and a half, he took off and his approval ratings went up to 58%. He won the biggest landslide since 1964. He was considered an amiable dunce. He was considered a guy who was too old for the office, right? Whereas the previous guy was kind of a ditherer, didn't really know how to manage Washington. You can see why there's some parallels, and Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump, in terms of their personal characters, couldn't be more different. And actually, I don't think Biden and Reagan have very much in common in terms of their character either. But in terms of their historical functions, I think that there are some parallels. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Biden people are referring to what Biden is doing as Bidenomics. And even the line he had this week is, I don't know what Bidenomics is, but it's working, is a line he stole from Reagan, okay? Or borrowed 50 or 40 years later. So I think that we are in this transition. I think that the question of what industrial policy is at the heart of it. And I want to begin by talking about why I think we're seeing a transition to something that we will call industrial policy. Whether it's fully deserves that name, I'll get to in a second. The reason I think that we're seeing this is that there are a number of different factions within the American political ecosystem that are all, for different reasons, as the panel this morning was discussing, interested in promoting some version of industrial policy. And by that I mean simply that the government should be more interventionistic into the economy in some way. So I'll just list those off. I wrote an article about this back in January, if you guys are interested in more details about it. So one category is jobs creators. We heard some things on the panel this morning, some skepticisms about whether they're actually going to be able to create jobs. But I think the place-based industrial policy that the Biden team is pursuing, putting money into red state areas out of these various bills, is part of that attempt to build jobs. There's also green tech accelerationists. That would be the people in this room, I think. There are social democrats who want a Green New Deal or want to do various kinds of what Ezra Klein would call everything bagel liberalism, but they feel like industrial policy is one way they can do that. Then there's sort of national developmentalists who feel like we need to re-onshore, production so that we can be more of a fortress America. And finally, there are what I would call supply chain hawks who are interested in, particularly coming out of the pandemic and thinking about chips and the threat that China might pose to our military supply chain, are interested in re-onshoring critical infrastructure of various sorts. So these factions, these five factions, cross both sides of the aisle. There's people who are Republicans and Democrats. They're not all Republicans or all Democrats will be in every one of these categories. I don't think there's a lot of social democrats that are in the social democratic faction or Republicans. I don't know how many national developmentalists you have among the Democrats, but you do have a number of people on both sides of the aisle who are able to make common cause about this stuff. And that's one of the signs that you see a transition to a new order is while there's one party that's sort of leading the charge, the other party is kind of grudgingly beginning to see how they might be able to go along with some version of it of their own. All right, so that's why I think that there's sort of a political reason to believe, both in terms of the longue durée historical structures in American politics and also in terms of the tactical politics in Washington right now around this topic. But I want to ask, what's different about industrial policy now? There's a reason why industrial policy, after all, was dropped in the 1970s in most places, including in even the heartlands of where it was happening, 70s and 80s. In France, it was largely banned, and MITI in Japan became a much less significant force. So it wasn't just in the United States and under Reagan and Thatcher in England that there was this rejection of industrial policy. It was really broad-based across the entire industrialized world. I think there are some differences now compared to last time. One is that there's much more place-based industrial policy that is trying to actually have a regional approach to industrial policy. We're not just going to create a chip sector. We're going to create a chip sector that's going to build factories in this place, that place, and the next place that is politically strategic in terms of domestic politics. I think that there are also differences in terms of not picking champions nearly as much. It's not about creating national champions, also discussed on this morning's panel. But some of the problems that attended to industrial policy, the critiques of industrial policy that emerged, this is something I know Ted's going to talk a little bit about in a moment, I think those critiques are still there. So I refer to these as the Hayekian conundrum on the one hand, and what we might call the Buchanan conundrum on the other hand. So the Hayekian conundrum says industrial policy can't work because government bureaucrats or any individual person, whether they're government or non-government, doesn't have enough information about all the signals in the economy and is inevitably going to make worse decisions than if you distribute the decisions out to market-based mechanisms and let the magic of the market sort out what the best solution is. I think that critique still applies, although I have reasons why I think that there are ways you can do industrial strategy that mitigate that one a little bit. The second critique, of course, is regulatory capture. This came out of it. It's the economist Buchanan here in Virginia won Nobel Prize for it back in the 1960s under the rubric of public choice theory, and basically said that agent principle problems in industrial policy mean that inevitably you're going to end up in a situation where there's going to be all kinds of pork barrel spending and graft, maybe formal, maybe informal, but there's just too many opportunities for people to take advantage of the fact that they're in privileged positions of decision-making and authority to deal for themselves and for their friends. I think those critiques are both valid, and I think we're seeing some of that today, and I don't think that they're things that can be done away with a magic wand, although I think they can be managed, and just even knowing about them means that you can have a strategy for mitigating some of those risks. Okay, so that's the second point I wanted to make. The third point I wanted to make is just my own principle, my Gandhian principle about, I'll stop in a second here. My Gandhian principle. I think there's basically three ways that industrial strategy can work effectively, and I think it deals with some of these two critiques somewhat. One is guaranteeing markets and de-risking markets. Another one is funding basic research. And the third one is sectoral rather than individual industry subsidies. So all those things were discussed this morning as well. I will note that probably the single best victory of industrial strategy of this decade was actually, again, initiated under Trump. It's Operation Warp Speed, and it had all of these characteristics. There was funding in basic research, Nobel Prize handed out this morning to the people who had done the basic research. Markets were guaranteed for the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the subsidy went to the sector as a whole rather than to individual companies. However, the more ambitious versions of industrial strategy that were being discussed this morning, I am very skeptical that the United States is capable of doing those things. And that is when you think about the totality of industrial strategy as it has been enacted in places like, most successfully in places like Singapore or Denmark, involve many, many more layers of coordination. Labor markets, education markets, private sector capital investment, public sector capital investment, supply chain management, basic R&D, regulatory and permitting reform, tax incentives and policies, all the things we talk about in these rooms year after year, these are super hard to coordinate, and they're very, very different constituencies that are pushing in different directions for it. And I'm skeptical that a country as large and pluralist and with as many veto points can be successful at that kind of more ambitious industrial strategy. I'll stop there.
All right, Ted.
Great.
Some
Thanks.
people, not me, but some people say, Ted, he's got everything he wanted. We got the innovation-focused, technology neutral, whatever, but he's addicted to complaining.
I can't. Absolutely.
So let's hear it.
So let's bring on the complaints. As I kind of hinted at least last night, I feel like kind of for the first half of Breakthrough's existence, I spent a lot of time arguing with folks on the right, making the case for public investment as a viable mechanism to sort of drive technological change. And in some way, we won because I spend less time doing that now. And I think, to Neil's part of that is because, in various precincts of the right, there's a lot less hostility to, maybe you don't put a label called industrial policy on it, but policies that some people, like Nils, would call industrial policy.
Sure.
So I thought I don't actually spend that, Ron will remember I used to spend a lot of time arguing with Ron Bailey about this stuff, and I don't know, we've both moved on to other things, I guess. And I spent a lot more time arguing with folks on the left about, kind of how to think about, how to bound, where the what kind of makes sense and what doesn't. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first is just that, as I think the left has become increasingly catastrophic about climate change, this sort of shift towards embracing industrial policy, public investment, innovation, all of it has been tied to the idea that you needed to do this innovation on this sort of timeline determined by climate science, whether that's Paris Agreement or 1.5 degrees or some net zero commitment that various people made. The second thing is that, as we've seen this shift, I just think there's just, we've tapped back into this sort of innate overconfidence among progressives in sort of technocratic omniscience. So this idea that these sort of all-seeing, wise, expert technocrats will be able to sort of plan our way to a fully net zero economy over the course of a couple of decades. And this has been in part driven by the rise of what I would call the technocratic modelers. So if you went back 10 or 15 years, when we kind of debated and talked about models in the climate context, it was models like my uncle's, kind of cost benefit, like make some assumptions about the discount rate and the rate of technological change and how much climate will cost, and you can argue about those assumptions, and then you kind of go, well, what's the kind of economically optimal? And there was not a lot of kind of like, okay, I can tell you what the cost curve on a solar panel is going to look like over 2 decades. And I think now we see a lot more of what I call this sort of technocratic modeling, where we're sort of modeling specific technocratic, specific technology pathways with a lot of confidence, and with the idea that in this sort of more granular, greater specificity, we can be more confident in the modeling results. And I actually would argue to you that everything we know about modeling is actually the opposite. Like the more granular and specified the modeling becomes, actually the more uncertainty you are actually introducing into the destination and how to get there, even as you're obscuring it with all of this sort of false specificity. The final thing, and this comes back, Matt has his sort of annual now reminder that the argument that he had with Breakthrough 15 years ago was around the role and value of carbon pricing, and that it has a value more on as a sort of budget mechanism as much as a mechanism for actually sort of driving an energy transition. But I think there's a way in which, like when I did argue with the left about this stuff 15 years ago or whatever, the basis of that argument was actually around the role of technology and pricing. And there was this sort of idea that really this energy transition could not be achieved simply through building sort of better mousetraps alone. That you needed a price on carbon or a sort of regulatory hammer to get this done. And what's happened over the last 15 years is I think a lot of people, not everybody, has recognized that that's probably not going to happen. Certainly the sort of carbon tax or cap and trade or economy-wide approach to this. But they haven't let go of the idea that it must happen, and we heard some of that on the panel this morning. And so the idea has become essentially, and I think sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, that the sort of subsidies would be a kind of sort of ad hoc sort of reverse carbon price. If we can't get the carbon tax or the cap and trade program or whatever, we'll just use subsidies. And what's implicit, and again, sometimes explicit in this, is that these are basically forever subsidies. This is not like subsidize the thing until it gets commercialized, gets to scale, price comes down. This is like we have to have the subsidies basically forever. And I'm going to come back to that with a bit of a provocation, especially for Jane at the end.
So much complaining already.
I know, so much. It's terrible. I can't. I don't know how you handle it. So I think the model that we've arrived at now is this sort of three-step move, which is one, put huge subsidies behind the technology. Two, basically create modeling of like the decarbonization in a given sector that will result from that. Three, kind of establish regulations into the 2030s based on the modeling that basically become a backstop in case all of this great rapid technological development and cost reduction, all of that doesn't happen. And I would argue that this results functionally in essentially establishing and mandating production targets for various sectors and industries. And I would suggest that, whatever you think of Hayek, Buchanan, anyone else, if you historically looked at the things where industrial policy really goes off the rails, that's generally when it happens, when we start kind of mandating output. So I'll wrap up with a couple of things because I'm running out of time here. So the first is I want to say that I still believe in public investment. I am not, as some people suggested, like you're going to end up being like a carbon pricer again and just internalize the externalities. I actually don't think that. I think that all this massive government investment is going to advance technology. It's just not necessarily going to do it in the ways that a lot of people anticipate or on the timeline that a lot of people insist it has to achieve that. Secondly, I think there continues to be a large role for public investment, demonstration, subsidies for initial commercialization, getting things to scale. But subsidies have to end. If you're really serious about making clean energy cheap, the subsidies have to go away. When we talked about shale gas, there was a 2-decade-long subsidy, and then it ended. It stopped, and we got really cheap shale gas. There's huge importance in the public sector in building the necessary enabling infrastructure. You can't do a lot of this, whatever your technological flavor that you prefer is, without a lot of infrastructure, whether it's like fuel infrastructure for nuclear power plants or transmission for renewable energy, charging stations for EVs. And you need to, at the same time, I think we're overly focused on regulating versus deregulating. I think deregulation is a much greater challenge for rapidly scaling clean energy than sort of these various regulatory proposals that the administration is moving forward with right now. And I think that there is a role for regulating, but there's in the kind of climate space, there's this kind of concept of sort of, do you stay within the fence, which goes back to the Obama era power plant rules, or go beyond it? I think de facto EPA is sort of trying to say they're staying within the fence, where they're really like promulgating standards that go beyond the fence and try to sort of force substitution of different technologies. I would argue that the right role for regulation in this context right now, with all the subsidies and other things we're doing, is actually within the fence to put sort of a moderate, sort of some price and regulatory pressure on the incumbent technologies. So finally, my provocation, which is if you believe that a full energy transition requires either a carbon price or alternately forever subsidies for the clean technology, price the dirty, or forever subsidize the clean, then I would argue that at the bottom of that are one of two assumptions. So either what you're saying is that fossil fuels are magic. They are fundamentally kind of different than other energy sources. And maybe someone here will suggest some other sort of rationalization for why that would be so. But the kind of main one that you hear, and I believe, it is an actual characteristic of the fuel, is energy density. Fossil fuels have this remarkable energy density that makes them very useful and usable in all sorts of contexts that nothing else has. So either you believe that's why we need to price carbon, subsidize the clean, or you believe, that really basically renewables really suck. They're actually not a very good energy technology. Therefore, we have to penalize the incumbent or subsidize the new thing. And I would just say that in either case, there is an energy technology. We can invent this energy technology that both has much higher energy density than fossil fuels and does not emit carbon. And I will leave it to your imagination what that technology is. On that note, I'll hand it over to Jen.
Back to where we started.
Okay.
Do you want to, am I?
I'm
just going to go.
Just do it.
Great, okay. I actually want to start with something that Nils said that I thought was a useful point of entry, which is sort of like, what is the work that this concept of industrial strategy, the political work that it does in a pluralist democracy, and why is that important? And it sort of reminds me of this Walter Lippmann quote that I could never actually find the original citation for, but it's this like, the goal of politics in a democracy is not to get people who think differently to think alike, but to get people who think differently to act alike. And as a political intervention, industrial policy and strategy is attractive for that reason. But for the purposes of this conversation, I want to be as clear as possible about what I see as the objective as a climate professional of climate industrial strategy, because I don't think it makes sense to evaluate something we call industrial policy outside of its effects in the world. So from my point of view, I think the objective here is to develop politically and economically feasible policies to limit the worst effects of climate change as rapidly as possible. And there is a science-based rationale for that objective. And there is temporal pressure. I mean, we can argue about the pace, but as a matter of prudent risk management, the faster we move to get to zero emissions, the faster we can stop the rate of warming, which is literally impossible until we hit that point. So maybe first I want to take a minute to say how grateful I am to be here today talking about these luxury problems in climate policy and politics. I started working on climate in 2009 in the wake of the collapse of Waxman Markey. It was a really rough decade plus for a young person who really cared about climate change at the time, fighting for very incremental progress at the federal level especially, and it was important to take all of these incremental steps. It laid the foundation for the policy and political framework that was ready to be advanced when the political window of opportunity opened around the IRA. But it was years, more than a decade, of hand-wringing about strategy, fighting over carbon pricing versus public investment, arguing over 100% renewables versus something more inclusive, arguing about innovation versus deployment, and very little impact on the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have now passed, in a very, very complicated moment, the most ambitious climate bill of my life, of history, and the fundamental tenets of that law transcend all of those crappy false dichotomies and dumb fights that I've spent the last decade having, essentially. We have technology policy now in the climate space for just about everything, from advanced geothermal to nuclear power to clean energy manufacturing to hydrogen to direct air capture. It is way, way, way better than I would have imagined even 2 or 3 years ago. And I do think Breakthrough played a really important role in advancing some of the basic ideas underpinning the strategy that got us to where we are today. So I would sort of expect more of a full-throated defense of it from Ted. It's a little bit giving Josh's description of a certain senator from West Virginia going from author to champion to critic. Second, I want to take a crack at defining how I think the administration is approaching climate industrial strategy from my perspective, and what about it is fundamentally novel or not. So, I think Nils laid this out very nicely, but the idea really rests on the fact that improving the economy and, importantly, orienting the economy toward public goals and missions requires intentional actions by governments in response to strategic needs. That markets themselves, like lots of other institutions, are in fact human artifacts and can and must be steered. And there is actually a pretty stark difference between that way of thinking about the role of government and the illusion of a kind of a laissez-faire approach that the US has subscribed to for the last several decades. More specifically, I think the Biden administration's industrial strategy is focused on raising the productive capacity of the economy in strategic sectors. That still does, to Nils's point, create the space for individual firms to compete and thrive or not, in most cases, actually, in most of these incentives, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, how novel is this? Is a more interventionist approach to public investment in strategic sectors truly some kind of historical break? I think the answer is obviously sort of yes and no. So Nils gave the full professorial history. And obviously there is, no, it's not entirely novel in the sense that there's a long history of these ideas, going back at least to Hamilton, but probably much further. And actually, as a practical matter, in the financial sector in the US, we have lots of tools to do what some people might think of industrial policy, including tools to stabilize supply through the Fed's monetary policy function. We just have had far fewer tools everywhere else. But it also is new in the sense that in the last few decades, we've seen a lot of deference to private markets, and in my view, a far too narrow analysis or theory of the role of the state in achieving social outcomes, including, importantly, thinking about this question narrowly through the lens of market failures and not public mission. And I think a lot of stuff is pretty new, actually, in this approach. So first, I think the place-based investments that Nils pointed out really is sort of fundamentally new, especially in regions that have left behind. I think the Brookings Institute counted 19 explicitly place-based industrial policy programs, adding up to more than $80 billion of authorized spending across IIJA, CHIPS, and ARP. That does not include the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's important. I mean, these place-based programs can actually address the sort of location-specific details of a given market problem, like a workforce training gap or the emergence of regional inequality. The second thing is that the Biden administration is very focused on investing in American workers in the middle class. It's really not a belief in a sort of trickle-down economics theory of the economy. There's lots of examples of this in these laws, including incentives for good-paying jobs and union workers in the IRA tax credits, and the fact that the way that this climate action is funded is actually through a tax on the uber wealthy, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind. I also think there are some really interesting and somewhat novel, we heard about this earlier today, rethinking around trade and market access and the role that should play in advancing American interests and values, rather than assuming market access is a right guaranteed to everyone. We're investing in driving down the cost of climate technologies here in the US, and the goal is, of course, to help accelerate global decarbonization. And lastly, I think the approach that we are taking now is not just about advancing kind of upstream R&D. That is clearly an important piece of an industrial strategy, but it's not the full sum of industrial strategy. And I'll say more about this in a minute, but I think we're seeing a lot more creativity, including on some of the market-shaping tools that Nils mentioned earlier in the context of Operation Warp Speed. And this is where some people in the room might point out that technology investment for climate is not fundamentally new. Of course not, and Breakthrough knows that and has done more work on this than almost anyone else. In like 2010 or something, Jesse and Alex and I were like running around writing papers about the role of the federal government in unconventional gas production and all sorts of climate technologies. And then we have the Energy Act of 2020, et cetera. But we have never had climate technology policy anywhere close to this scale. That's important. And secondly, these investments are quite different in kind. I think we have a lot more creativity about downstream innovation tools like demand pull incentives to create markets through ideas like Buy Clean, or the Department of Energy using $1 billion from the Hydrogen Hubs program to figure out how to do some kind of demand pull program. We also have technology-inclusive subsidies for climate for the first time, and much broader sectoral coverage of the suite of innovation or industrial policy tools that we're leveraging, including looking at the industrial sector really for the first time in a serious way in a long time. There's a lot more to do there, though. Lastly, I want to say just a word about pragmatism and policy if we're trying to limit the worst impacts of climate change. So one of the things I've always appreciated about the kind of breakthrough-ian approach to climate action is, at least in my view, what it means to me, is in part that it's important to take political constraints seriously and to see them as relatively binding and to optimize strategy in the context of those constraints. And as a trained social scientist, I think one of the underlearned lessons in our world is that engineering social change is often much harder than engineering technological change. And I fully agree with this, and my research has underscored this, and I think that that's a really powerful insight that Breakthrough has also advanced. And I care a lot about climate change. And it is my contention, and I believe this is probably supported by the research, that making clean energy cheap is a necessary, but at this point probably insufficient condition for climate action at the speed and scale that is required as a matter of risk management. And the goal of climate industrial strategy is not to pursue R&D funding as an end in and of itself, but to pursue it because it is in service of a greater public goal, or maybe several. In an ideal world, of course, clean energy subsidies would be temporary. You'd want to support technologies that could eventually compete on their own. But the terrain on which they are competing is important to keep in mind. There are huge incumbency advantages to the existing system we have today, physical, economic, and political. And unless and until there's some effort to price or mandate the cleanness of these technologies, if we take this gets to, I think, maybe one of the central tensions between Ted and my view here. If we think that the temporal pressure matters, if we think we do have to act very quickly, then we do need to find a way to value the clean part. And subsidies and the regulations do that. It may not be efficient, but it's pragmatic. And so far it has been a cost that our politics have been willing to bear. And Democrats are doing this right now. Biden pursued an investment-led, technology-inclusive approach to decarbonization that included subsidies and actually, as we all made rest in peace, the CEPP, which was a power sector CES, which Breakthrough has advocated for in the past at the state level, by the way, I might note. And when politics killed the emissions cap, we kept pushing, playing the cards that we were dealt. And I'll just close by saying there will surely be trade-offs in all of this, and managing the risks of potential political blowback that undermines future climate action is something I think is incredibly important and I'm very concerned with. But it is hard to know when and how that will happen, in the same way it's hard to know when and how the power system will evolve in our models. And there was no plausible alternative to what we just did to make the impact on climate that we made. And if there is one, I would love you to tell me what it is.
Well, so I want to actually pivot a little bit away from climate change for a second, Nils, because I think clearly part of the context of industrial policies, as you were saying, is a heightened sense of national security and foreign policy concern, right? That like part of what's going on in the solar industry, right? I mean, people are interested in solar power for climate reasons, but then it turns out that like if you want to make clean energy cheap, the best thing to do is to buy the solar panels from China. But if you want to have strategic competition with China, you maybe don't want to do that, and you want to spend, you want to subsidize a domestic industry, something like that. And so, I mean, how do you see this kind of like fracturing of world politics as changing the domestic politics in the United States?
Yeah, so I actually just read a book called Underground Empire by Henry Farrell, which I would recommend, which is about the sort of rise of global communications and financial infrastructure, and the way that the US over the last couple of decades has weaponized that to first go after Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, and has now been using it to go after Russia and particular people in the Chinese military establishment and so on. And I do think that we are moving away from globalization, and with the panel this morning talked about how getting sued by the WTO is a feature, not a bug, in these policies. And I do think that we're seeing a fragmentation. This is part of the end of the previous era. One of the defining features of the era of globalization or neoliberalism, whatever we call it, is we're supposed to be continuously, lowering trade barriers and doing integration. I think people are moving away from that, partly for national security reasons and geopolitical competition reasons, and partly also just for supply chain security reasons, which are separate conceptually at least, from the national security concerns. So what are we breaking into? I think I'm skeptical of the view that we're going to move towards a Cold War, totally separated economies. In fact, the trade between the U.S. and China has not gone down practically at all in the last 7 years, despite both Trump and Biden saying that we need to do this. Now, maybe it's better that we're not trading chips with them. We're just trading T-shirts and microelectronics. So maybe it's okay. Like if our iPhone supply gets cut off during the invasion of Taiwan, it's not the end of the world. But I do think that re-onshoring our ability to produce these kinds of green technologies is related to the fact that people are worried. I think, it's not just about the solar panels, because we can do without new solar panels for a year or two during a war. But if there's, electric vehicles that are being serviced remotely by computer, and they're all enrolling computers now, and those are being controlled by an adversary that also can attack your electrical grid, and the electrical grid also is powering your transportation infrastructure, this is a big concern. And I think it's not a surprise that the Biden administration has mandated decarbonization of all sectors of the federal government, except for the U.S. military, which is responsible for 75% of all the emissions in the U.S. government, right? It's because the energy density of hydrocarbons right now, we don't yet have a nuclear-powered airplane, although there were discussions about building those in the 1950s. I think there might be some downsides to that, but
That's fine.
But I do think that is an issue, and I do think we're going to be moving towards more of a block-by-block world over the next couple of decades, and green technology is part of that story.
Right. And, Ted, you were talking about, indefinite subsidies, right? And that seems bad, contrary to a kind of an innovation framework. But earlier today, we were in the little briefing about the NRC and nuclear technology. And one thing that came up there is that, the precious advanced nuclear reactors are relying on Russian fuel right now, which there's a problem with, right? But that's not a dollars and cents problem, and it's not a climate problem. It's a national security problem. And it seems to me that even if everything went well with the technology and with the regulation, you might need, I don't want to say forever, but indefinitely, some kind of subsidization to create this American nuclear industry that you want. And if you really believe in that,
if you actually look at the last American nuclear industry, that really wasn't the case. We spent, you can get different estimates on it, but if you really look at the cost of commercializing light water reactors, out of the Navy, put aside all the weapons stuff and a bunch of other stuff that gets lumped in there, the cost of that was, I think about $4 billion in today's dollars. A kind of remarkably small amount of money to kind of demonstrate the technology initially, get the initial supply chains up. And then, frankly, the rest of the nuclear fleet, 100 reactors, was sort of basically, sort of built through the kind of, primarily through the cost of service, monopoly utility model. The cost of it was rate-based. It was financed over, 40, 60 years with low-cost capital that was not subsidized by the government. And, you get lots of people going, well, yeah, that was just the corrupt utilities. It's all built into this corrupt old monopoly utility model, except that, that's about among the cheapest electricity that we have kind of anywhere in this country. So whatever corruption, small corruptions were involved in the old utility model to get those nuclear plants built, when you kind of look at the sort of long-term costs of the electricity they provide for 40, 60, even 80 years, it turned out to be really cheap. So I would kind of actually push back a little bit at the idea that nuclear, just like renewables or whatever, will require forever subsidies in order to work. And that actually hasn't proven the case with the old nuclear technology. It will recall, to your point, and I agree with it, obviously that's what we're doing. It will require substantial public support to kind of get this new generation of technology commercialized, especially after we spent 40 years literally not building any of it.
But Ted, don't you think, though, that, in a globalized economy, there will be some industries that achieve cost effectiveness, or some parts of supply chains that achieve cost effectiveness that's better than what we can achieve in the US, and that sometimes those will be in adversary states. And that under those circumstances, we may need to subsidize it because rather than get the cheap fuel from Russia, we need to actually pay for it because we don't want to get the cheap fuel from Russia. That's what requires a subsidy relative to the global market.
Also just to be clear, the existing nuclear fleet is getting a pretty generous production tax credit, production subsidy through the IRA.
Well, because mostly the existing nuclear fleet is fine if it's in a cost of service monopoly utility. I mean, the places, the nuclear fleet that actually requires subsidy are in places that deregulated and liberalized
But these same arguments
electricity.
could be made, I mean, the incumbency dynamics, the fact that these markets are not perfectly structured today and are putting nuclear at a disadvantage could also be made for renewables in different contexts, right? Like the subsidy is required not only to accelerate the technologies down the cost curve right now, which is the primary aim, and by the way, it is still relatively early in the lifetime of renewable technologies. They still represent a pretty, maybe not as a numerical over time, but they still represent a pretty small share of penetration into the grid. So I think this gets to Catherine made this great point about broadening how we think about innovation, and we don't really yet know how these systems are going to operate with higher penetration of renewable power. And so I don't really think, I think you can't make the argument that, yeah, sure, nuclear may need a federal subsidy, the existing fleet may need a federal subsidy because markets are imperfectly designed, but that doesn't apply for renewables.
Well, no, I mean, those plants were built and operated in a different system for much of their life, and then we changed the rules in pursuit of this sort of holy grail of, what is ironic to me with all this talk of new industrial policy and the end of neoliberalism is basically the entire, certainly in the electrical sector, the entire sort of premise of decarbonization, primarily driven by renewable energy, is predicated on basically deregulating and liberalizing electricity markets. And wherever you fall, one side or the other on that argument, it sure doesn't sound like not neoliberal to me. It sounds like deeply neoliberal in the most kind of corrupt way that progressives have always talked about it in other contexts, which is that you deregulate the market, supposedly deregulate the market, and then you pump enormous taxpayer subsidies to sort of favored firms to make money. And the interesting thing is when you go look at those markets, the cost of electricity is higher, and the carbon intensity is higher in almost every place. So this is like the kind of underlying, certainly in the electricity market, this is the underlying sort of apparently not neoliberal model, but it sure looks neoliberal. If I understand
but this
what
is a
anyone
critique
means,
now
yeah.
of electricity deregulation
Right.
from the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Not of
Well, no, we're still trying to do
IRA
this.
or-
I mean, frankly, the renewables advocates, Google, they're trying to dismantle TVA. They're trying to actually liberalize the remaining cost of service markets so that essentially, like tech firms and others can opt out of the kind of regulated utility system and just kind of buy their electricity from whoever they want to. And again, the costs get externalized to taxpayers. So I mean, I don't want to get to have this electricity conversation take over it, but I do have to say that it's kind of curious to me kind of where we actually end up, which is, basically, and if you want to kind of combine the sort of Hayekian critique with the Buchanan critique, you kind of get a political class that for a variety of both ideological and kind of economic reasons is sort of driving the whole system towards this kind of Rube Goldberg-esque kind of solution of variable renewable energy and batteries and massive transmission infrastructure that requires kind of market, specially kind of not market markets on top of other specially constructed not market markets and all kinds of subsidized, just to get the system to do what it actually did in a pretty simple way is just a basic public utility. I kind of not so sure that I don't. That does not
Okay, but
inspire
nuclear
my
is
confidence.
subsidized.
Pardon,
The
what?
end. But nuclear is subsidized.
I mean,
Today.
some nuclear, as of the passage of IRA, is subsidized. Most of it doesn't need to be.
But I want to go back and ask the question. I want to repeat the question I asked you a second ago, though. In a globalized
Yes.
market.
Because
Right.
I mean, this is, I think, a critical question, right? So you can have like, what's the cost of the technology, right? So
Right.
like an iPhone is like pretty cheap, right? But the reason an iPhone is cheap is that Apple uses the lowest cost suppliers to manufacture
Right.
the iPhone. If we were to decide that is bad for America, right? Then the new like USA phone would not be cheap. Not because smartphones are inherently expensive, but because the policy objective is expensive. The United States is a rich country. It's a high-wage country. Because it's a high-wage country, we put a relatively high value on local environmental impacts compared to a lot of other places. That makes it challenging for us to be the lowest cost supplier of everything that is going into a supply chain, and especially of like uranium mines and enrichment facilities. And then we layer on top of that, we have proliferation concerns, we have national security concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think at the end of the day, advocates for nuclear as a technology and the companies that do that are going to find themselves saying, yeah, we might need indefinite subsidy to build an American industry that's safe, that's clean, that's not dependent on Russian fuel, et cetera, and that's just not going to be that different from anything else. It depends on one's level of optimism about batteries, I think, not one's assessment of like the wisdom of subsidies.
I agree with this, and I just want to pile on a little bit, Ted, which is that the entire Defense Department is based on a mission, and it's an effectiveness criteria, not an efficiency criteria. And if you think it's a national security issue, both to make a decarbonization as rapidly as possible, and you think it's a national security issue that rapid decarbonization can't be dependent on critical elements of the supply chain that are located in adversary states, that's just, you pay for it the same way you pay a lot of money to get an aircraft carrier.
I mean, I don't actually have, a problem with, if we decide that we don't want to get our solar panels or our iPhones from China, and that we decide that's a national priority, sure, kind of go for it. And we probably won't kind of do that with perpetual subsidies. We'll just put like tariffs and other trade barriers. That's actually how we do it. And like obviously we kind of basically trying to say we don't want lots of Russian stuff right now, including uranium. And we'll find ways to do that, and we'll probably create some level of subsidies initially for some of these, in some of these spaces to get things sort of scaled up. But then the question is like, I'm not quite sure why you need to perpetually subsidy if you just like put trade barriers in place.
Well, so Jane, now let me ask you about political constraints, right? Because I think there's sort of two ways of reading political constraints, and the Biden administration, I think, dances on both sides of them, right? One is to say, okay, we have a narrow political constraint. Congress won't vote for a carbon price. And so therefore, we need to do something that is politically tractable, which is to say we're going to put subsidies for electric cars in place, then we're going to have a model of EV adoption. And then based on that model, we can have the EPA do a cost-benefit analysis of a requirement around cars that'll say, well, it's going to be cheap to consumers because it's subsidized. Then you put the requirement in place, and then if it turns out that the model's wrong, it doesn't matter because the rule's already on the books, right? And so that's like, we have a political constraint and we have to try to find loopholes. Another way is to say, look, there's like a deep political constraint, which is that we can't ask people to make large short-term economic sacrifices for the sake of a global long-term problem, right? And I mean, I guess I wonder, like, which do you see them working with? Has there been an internalization of sort of deep constraints, or are they really just looking for, gimmicks or ways to obscure costs from people?
No, I think there has been an internalization of the deep constraints. I think there is sometimes confusion about the relative weight to place on coalition management within the Democratic caucus as weighed against the broader deep constraint about nobody wants to pay more for their energy. I mean, that I think, and that's tricky. That's just like a tricky thing to manage. But, you know, I think I, unsurprisingly perhaps, do not think that performance-based cafe standards are production quotas, and think that they play and have historically played an important sort of technology forcing role in the world, and think that it's like entirely appropriate, and in fact, arguably constitutionally required at this point that EPA do this. So I don't think of the EPA regulations as inherently in tension with the deeper political constraint.
All right, I think
if the models are right, you know, and if they're wrong, we'll got to deal with that when we get there, I guess.
we hope for the best. I think Thea was signaling me that I should wrap it up. Oh, question. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, do people have questions here in the audience? I think there's a lot of good stuff. Okay, yeah.
Matt, can we take a few at a time?
Oh, okay, sure. Who else? All right, yeah. That looks like 3. Yeah. Let's start asking.
Yeah, so I guess this is related to the last discussion. So sorry, it needs to be Okay, this is related to particularly to the last discussion between Matt and Jane, but in general, Matt, you write from time to time about how Joe Biden should run to the center and remind people of things specifically about oil and gas production. And the assumption is there's all these people out there who would vote for him if they knew that, and they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump or Republicans in general, except that the problem is that people out there know at a deep level, to use the deep constraint idea, that the Democratic coalition wants gas in cars to be more expensive. They don't know about all this policy wonkery, but they kind of have, that's gotten through. Mm-hmm. And how do you then overcome that, whether you're a Democratic operative mm-hmm. or whether you're somebody who wants to engage with the longer term goals about
right.
climate?
All right, got some more questions.
Hi, Zan from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Jane also used to be at the Bipartisan Policy Center. There are 3 of us. Soon dozens, maybe. So picking up on a couple threads here. One is the idea that we can't always get Congress to think alike, but we can sometimes get them to act alike. And we talked a lot about domestic regulation, domestic subsidies, and we had a little touch around actual trade remedies and tariffs. But there's a lot of growing interest in the idea of tariffs that aren't necessarily protectionist based, but are more carbon intensity based, that kind of split the difference. Can you talk a little bit about the role that could play in this policy?
Can we get one more question?
Andy Herskowitz from ODI, but with the U.S. government for the last 22 years until about a month ago. So I just wanted to share a few perspectives. You know, it seems to me that really industrial policy really is government entrepreneurship, and it's something that we've never questioned when it's the U.S. military doing it. And really, rather than question whether we should be doing it or not, it's not being driven just for economic reasons, as you've pointed out. It's for
let's get a question.
Okay. All right. Question is, it's actually a comment, and I want to hear this. Rather than focus on whether we should have industrial policy, its question is how can you make it effectively execute industrial policy? Because there has been research written on this. It says this is where it has worked well. Mm-hmm. We're going to do it, but the focus really should be what do we need to do to make it work well?
Yeah. So to Virginia, I mean, I think this is kind of a fake it till you make it kind of situation, and that's exactly why it's contested so vigorously. Jane, what's the deal with international?
Oh, yeah, great. I mean, I think we had a good discussion about the dynamics with the EU in particular this morning, but as someone who spent some time in the White House on industrial decarbonization, you really can't talk about industrial decarbonization in any way without talking about the broader global context, since these are highly price-sensitive, globally traded commodities. And I think, as I said, I think there had been an assumption for a long time that market access was a right, not a privilege. And I think one of the things that could be a really important tool for driving greater investment domestically and globally in industrial decarbonization is leveraging market access, both granting market access more generously and constraining it in certain cases based on the carbon content of traded goods. And there's already a fair amount of carbon embedded in traded goods that is not captured as it crosses borders in any way. And I think it could be a really powerful tool. Now, its relationship to a border adjustment mechanism, I think, is interesting. I spent a lot of time on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum when we were in the White House, where we inherited these 232 tariffs. It was pretty clear that the problem in the steel industry was Chinese dumping, essentially, of quite dirty steel. And so the notion was that there might be an opportunity to work with our allies to identify a sort of climate club or trade regime, the criteria for membership for which would not be you must adopt an explicit policy mechanism, but rather you must do whatever it is that your domestic politics allows you to do to drive down the emissions intensity of your steel and aluminum. And from my point of view, that kind of approach to thinking about trade, the intersection of trade and climate, is both more in line with the tenets of the Paris Agreement. That's a much more sort of bottom-up approach and has the potential to be really catalytic.
So Nils, you'd kind of rattled off a few countries that you saw as maybe more capable than the United States of pulling off industrial. What's the positive model from those places?
Well, I'll talk about one that I know particularly well, which is Denmark. The two that I've spent some time looking at and time in talking to people doing it are Denmark and Singapore. And obviously the first thing you notice about Denmark and Singapore is they have less than 6 million people each. Yeah, and they are small. Singapore is not that homogenous, but in some cultural way it's actually quite homogenous. They have both ththese countries have extremely deep civil service benches that are totally respected. They're the highest status jobs in the country practically. And I'm rattling off things that we don't have. They have integrated education and labor policies. Part of it is that they are quite equal societies, so that being tracked at the age of 15 into a line of work, which is going to be a laborer, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a much worse life than the person who goes to college and gets an R&D degree. I have cousins in Denmark who are extremely successful business people, and I have cousins who are carpenters, and they all get 5 weeks of vacation and go to the Mediterranean every summer. And that means that you can actually have a much more effective industrial strategy. Because people are willing to accept their positions within society because they're not radically unequal. Another thing that they do well is there's a lot more labor, business, government comity in terms of how they interact with each other and develop a strategy together. A little bit more repressive in Singapore, a little bit more collaborative in Denmark. But these things are real. And I do think that the UAW strike, I'm not arguing against a strike, but it's characteristic of an antagonistic relationship between labor and management, which is endemic in the United States and has been historically that way for a long time, which doesn't really obtain. These things make it much harder to solve the coordination problems. So I don't have silver bullets for you on these things, but I do think that figuring out some of those things. And the other thing is the United States is radically decentralized. I think there was a comment this morning about the fact that many of the challenges in terms of implementation are happening at the state and local level. And those are coordination problems of their own and way less governmental capacity to do these things effectively, typically. Now, can these things be built? I think they can. I think the cultural obstacles I was just describing are harder in terms of education policies and social inequality driving insecurities about being positioned in certain places in the economy. But I think some of these other governmental capacity pieces are things we can build over time. Not if we implement Schedule F, but yes.
The dream. Can we grab some more questions here? We got you back there.
Jonah Messenger. My question is sort of for Nils, but then I guess more broadly for everyone. It's interesting to me that so many either current or former Biden administration folks seem to sort of they really actually wanted the carbon price, even now, but they'll settle for the sort of quote-unquote industrial policy Bidenomics. And then the way that manifests in the electricity market is, as Ted was sort of pointing out, lots of industrial policy subsidies for clean electricity technologies that are zero marginal costs, fundamentally do very well, and are partial to a deregulated electricity market, which is kind of like a neoliberal order paradigm. So for Nils, it seems like there's this acceptance that we are for sure moving towards industrial policy, but it is sort of interesting that the industrial policy actually feels fundamentally very neoliberal, like maybe we're actually not.
Jordan McGillis, Manhattan Institute. This morning, Josh Fried characterized geoeconomics in the current century as dividing into two blocks, a more liberal democratic bloc and a more authoritarian bloc. I, however, don't think that makes sense when you look at countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and perhaps most interestingly, Vietnam. I'd like to hear how you think the geoeconomics will shake out in the next 10, 20 years.
Can we get one more?
Kyle Danish from Van Ness Development. I found, Niels, your analysis so interesting about a sort of new order, but it seems to me that it's important to remember that this passed by almost like one vote.
Yeah.
And so I wonder whether we're really there. And I'm sort of curious about the views of the panel on sort of political durability as a sort of priority in this policy, the sense that if we're going to decarbonize over a long period of time, we actually have to set up a policy that creates enough winners through place-based policies and indefinite subsidies that you just create a whole bunch of political, sort of durable political support for the policy. I feel like that's a little bit underanalyzed in this case. I'm sort of interested in groups.
Well, I think that if you take the idea of an industrial policy paradigm seriously, right? IRA passes very, very narrowly, but CHIPS, IIJA, the previous energy bill, and then also everything Donald Trump did had elements of this step toward industrial policy, right? And then it's possible, there's I think a debate inside that paradigm of how urgent is the problem of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but the industrial policy aspect of IRA, I think, is not what's controversial about it, right? Ted seems like a little wishy-washy on should we reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and Republicans just definitely don't want to.
I'm not wishy-washy on it. I just don't think we're going to do it on these timetables.
But yeah, so where's the geoeconomics when you're finding allies to make steel with, Jane?
Me?
Yeah, who counts?
Who are our allies?
Yeah, is there really a two-block world, or can we get Indonesian steel?
Yeah, I think that these things are much more plastic than maybe Josh would have suggested at the outset. And I think the Biden administration is very, very eager to make common cause with a wide range of nations, including through our climate strategy. But I'm not going to opine much further about the future of geoeconomics. It does feel like a Nils question, though.
Do you guys want to debate the meaning of neoliberalism? Yeah. That's a great panel topic.
I just want to amplify what you were just saying, Matt, which is that anytime you have a historians love to periodize things. Something changed on such and such a date. But the historians also love to talk about continuities. I'm always struck by the fact that the current consensus among historians of the French Revolution is that it didn't matter. Which is kind of remarkable. It's the most important thing that ever happened, and yet it doesn't matter according to current historiography. So there's always continuities that we can talk about, right? And there's continuities from the 70s through the 80s, and yet you can point to things, and I think you were just doing a nice job of that, Matt, trade policy. Donald Trump just threw out the idea that we're going to do free trade, and now that's pretty much embraced. I do think that the question of blocks is an interesting one. The Europeans, I was just in Europe talking about this issue with them.
They hate it.
They hate it. They feel the attitude that the Americans have is, why don't you guys do your own subsidies too? And they're like, you're blowing up the entire system, and they're much more committed to these institutions in some ways than we are. The European Union is an entity that was set up to really impose these kinds of neoliberal rules much more than the United States was, actually. There's actually less economic balkanization, you might say, there than there is here, ironically. So I do think that we are maybe seeing multiple blocks. I do think that what those divisions are going to look like will shake out around particular technology stacks. I do think that there's going to be pretty significantly different technology stacks between particularly the Chinese and maybe the Americans, and Europeans will be together, but the Europeans want to regulate things differently. The stack consists of hardware, software, and also standards about accessibility, about privacy and issues like that. So the Indians, I think, are going to have their own kind of hemispheric stack as well. How absolutely hermetically sealed off these will be from one another, that depends on how much conflict there is between them. But I do think that for security reasons, we're going to see at least 4. There's going to be a European one, an American one, a Chinese one, an Indian one. Maybe there's going to be a separate Russian one. Maybe the Russians will end up under the Chinese banner because they're probably not big enough and competent enough to run their own full stack supply chain. But I do think it's going to be like that. Now, there's still going to be trade. As I was saying earlier, like we're still doing more trade with China than we ever have. We're just not going to do it about these strategic things quite as much. That's my anticipation of where things are going to go. Things could blow up quite literally. If there's a war in Taiwan, all bets are off about, if there's a shooting war between, directly between the U.S. and China, who knows, right? Who knows what can happen at that point?
I wanted to address a couple of the questions.
Yeah.
So, to Kyle's question, I think, I take and have long used the same quote Jane uses about people kind of doing the same thing for different ends. And I would say when we kind of go through a set of these big policies things that have happened over the last few years, one of those things is not like the others, and that's IIJA, which was done on a straight party line vote. So if I was going to kind of look at the things that I think are likely to be sort of robust and be able to sort of sustain shifts in political power, electoral coalitions, things like that, is probably more likely to be the bipartisan infrastructure package, CHIPS, the 2020 energy package. I think IRA is a different animal, and I think there are kind of real risks that a bunch of this stuff is going to get rolled back pretty quickly. Democrats lose power. Matt's kind of question to Jane, which is, well, who are we supposed to work with to do all this green steel or whatever? Well, I mean, when you get to a lot of these questions, for instance, around things like critical minerals, my colleagues, Seaver, Ashley, and Peter just released a study just looking at, even if you took literally all of the critical mineral production, not only in the US, but with every other ally, every other trading partner that has most favored nation status, you get, under realistic deployment strategies for EVs, you get to about halfway of where actually you need to be to hit the EPA requirements. And that's that's assuming a pretty large expansion of production in those places. And then I wanted to just, to Andy's and Neil's remarks on industrial policy, again, I actually have I've long argued for industrial policy, and I think the question that Andy asked is the right one, which is, what is the right model, or models? And I think that I would kind of put a further point on that, which is, to Neil's point, I don't think you can look to Singapore or Denmark. So the real question is, what are the right models in our system? And I think we have some good models. Shale being one sort of model. I think another great one is commercial space flight. And frankly, warp speed is another. If I was going to identify like 3 things that is kind of like, okay, model your industrial policies for climate on these things, those would be the 3 things. I would just suggest that there's a hell of a lot in the current sort of post-IRA paradigm that kind of has not taken a lot of the lessons in those from those examples to heart.
And I think a big part of that, right, is that part of these successful strategies, both in the U.S. and abroad, is there's an element of like clearing the decks for innovation, right? Like you got to sort of be the heavy a little bit and say like we're gonna get some stuff out of your way as a private industry, and I don't think we've seen a lot of that from Biden, right? Where you gotta pick it. Like we're gonna grow this industry. In the panel this morning, there was this question. It's like, do progressives like industries enough?
Well, we
to
also
have an
haven't really
industrial
talked about
policy?
the deregulatory side of it, which is another example of that, where it's like, okay, you want to do all of this? Fix NEPA. Fix the, figure out how you're going to go mine a hell of a lot more critical minerals over the next decade in this country. Fix the NRC. I mean, we can kind of go down a pretty big list of kind of deregulatory things that, I think even when you kind of start digging into, as we've started doing, any of these sort of post-IRA modeling of all these emissions reductions that are going to materialize, I mean, the biggest obstacles are actually sort of deregulatory problems that I see very little evidence, that either the administration or Congress is very serious about dealing with them. Here's, deregulation for industrial policy is another interesting conversation.
And I wonder what you think about that, right? I mean, when people toss these ideas around in their head, I think it's like there's deregulation, but that's neoliberal. So if we're doing industrial policy, it must be the other one.
I think that, again, there's continuities. I mean, I don't know that was the paradigm shift that marked the shift from the New Deal highly regulated order to the neoliberal order. Now I think it's about regulatory reform. We need to have incentives in some ways. Some things need to be deregulated. Some things need to be regulated more. So I think it's a different mix this time in terms of the transition. It's not just a pure deregulatory model, because the problems we're trying to solve for are not de facto, the things that drove deregulation in the late 70s and early 80s were basically de facto state-granted monopolies. And that's not the thing that we're dealing with here. So I think it's a little bit of a different problem. Deregulating the airline industry was motivated by a very different thing than what we're talking about the deregulation of NEPA.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right, can we do one more?
Hi, Isuru Sen. Just want to follow up on one of the questions that maybe didn't get answered. The electric grid, we're having problems with the kind of reliability concerns, the NERC, the FERC coming up with these issues. And back to Ted's point about nuclear being successful in these integrated monopoly kind of models. What's the future there in terms of, do we see more kind of muscular TVA type entities that need to kind of take on this role of being the kind of underwriter for the whole grid? Or how do we get out of the deregulated morass that is the electric grid right now to get to a reliable carbon-free grid?
I think we'll take maybe one more from Jennifer.
Hi, so Governor Jerry Brown, the icon, some now 15 years ago said that climate change is a problem, big problem. California is less than 1% of global anthropogenic emissions, the way we calculate it, which excludes forest fires and other stuff. But bottom line is, unless we do things that others will follow, we will fail.
Right.
And it seems like that whole part of the how replicable, how affordable, how desirable, how politically embraceable is this agenda, in which case, what is the agenda informed by those factors? It just never seems to grab much attention. And right now, California is like, yeah, I know, it's going to cost a lot more for poor people, but that's a big bummer. And yeah, those are like, those are not likely white people, that's another big bummer. And those are on page 125 and 126 of the scoping plan. Those aren't exaggerations. So where is this kind of replicability, scalability, political sustainability part of this discussion on industrial policy?
You want to take on the electrical question?
Sure. I mean, on the one hand, I'm kind of very skeptical that we're going to go launch a bunch of new TVAs anytime soon. And I do think it is still worth kind of paying attention to that in the midst of all of this talk of the new industrial policy post-neoliberal, we seem to not actually just kind of believe, we had this thing that actually worked pretty well, just the old-fashioned utility model, we still do it for water, we still do it for how we do it for like cable television, but apparently we cannot do it for electricity anymore. And of course, that was a model that actually allowed for a lot of the kind of sort of planning, long-term planning and coordination that that apparently we need to do to kind of enact this energy transition. But it is apparently not even remotely worth talking that this might be the model for kind of like how we would kind of go build out a clean energy electrical grid, much less a clean energy economy. So that would be mine.
We're a little short on time, but Jane, do you maybe want to say something about industrial decarbonization and its role in that kind of global adoption zone? Because I feel like that's...
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I do agree with some of the criticism about is I think there is a tendency to hand wave at learning rates and then like run in the other direction and just sort of be like, well, we're spending a lot of money on clean energy technology and yada, 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 and then everything will be cheap. And then that will enable global decarbonization. And there's research happening. Greg Nemeth has done great work on solar panels. Like there is research that's happening on this, but our fundamental understanding of like what the drivers of cost declines and learning rates actually are, in what context they work and don't work, I think that's an area that is like very much underexplored. I think broadly, I subscribe to like some dimensions of the breakthrough theory of change here, which is that core to the political replicability of any of this stuff is the United States, in this case, taking on the work to drive down the cost of these technologies so that they are usable elsewhere with expenditure of less political capital, basically, to overcome cost barriers. Like that, I think, is a social good that the United States can do and a climate good the United States can. I did want to say one thing about the political durability, because I don't think it's just about sort of like bribing red states with investments, nor is it just about everything bagel liberalism, the Biden administration kind of giving cookies to everybody within the coalition. I think the thing that actually makes some on the left nervous, but I think is really critical here is intentionally growing concentrated industries that stand to benefit from more ambitious climate action in the future. Now, you run the risk of regulatory capture over the long term if taken too far, but you can't at once say part of the reason we can't have ambitious climate action is because of powerful entrenched capital incumbents, and then not drag some part of capital with you as you're trying to overthrow them. And so that, to me, actually is important. And I've been thinking about this a lot more because the expiration of the child tax credit is sort of a good example of like maybe this theory of policy feedback loops not working as well. And I think that is actually one of the big differences, the existence of the coalition of capital, green capital.
All right, thank you all. I don't want to cut too much into everyone's afternoon free time, so let's have fun.